What if I told you there's a version of the US dollar that the Federal Reserve has absolutely no control over? No printing press, no interest rate lever, no oversight, trillions of dollars circulating right now completely outside the American financial system. It's not a conspiracy, it's not crypto. It's called the Eurodollar system, and it is the most important financial mechanism most people have never heard of. Here's what's wild. This system didn't come from a government decision or a banking summit or some international treaty. It was created almost by accident during the Cold War, and it grew into something so massive that it now dwarfs the actual US money supply. I'll get to how that happened, but first, you need to understand what this thing actually is. The name is misleading. Eurodollars have nothing to do with the euro currency. The term just means US dollars held in banks outside the United States. A Japanese bank holding dollars in Tokyo, a British bank holding dollars in London, a Brazilian company borrowing dollars from a Swiss institution. None of that goes through the Fed. None of it is insured by the FDIC. It exists in a kind of financial parallel universe, operating on trust, contracts, and interbank relationships. And here's why it matters. When a company in South Korea wants to buy oil from Saudi Arabia, they don't settle in won. They don't settle in reals. They settle in dollars. But not dollars that touched American soil. Eurodollars. This is why the dollar became the world's reserve currency. Not just because America is powerful, but because the world built its own dollar system independent of America. The demand for dollars is baked into global trade at a structural level. But let's go back to where this actually started, because the origin story is stranger than most people realize. It's the 1950s. The Cold War is in full swing. The Soviet Union is sitting on dollar reserves earned from commodity exports, but they don't want to keep those dollars in American banks. They're terrified the US government could freeze the accounts at any moment. So they deposit them in a Soviet-owned bank in London, Banque Commerciale pour l'Europe du Nord. Its telex address? Eurobank. That's it. That's where the name comes from. The Soviets, trying to hide money from America, accidentally created the foundation for a multi-trillion-dollar offshore financial system that would come to underpin the entire global economy. But they weren't alone for long. European banks quickly realized if you hold dollars outside the US, you don't have to follow American banking regulations. No reserve requirements, no interest rate ceilings. You could offer better rates to depositors and borrowers alike. Money flooded in, and the system exploded. By the 1970s, the Eurodollar market was already so large that economists were struggling to measure it. By the 2000s, it was estimated at somewhere between $10 and $13 trillion, larger than the entire US domestic money supply. Now here's where it gets genuinely strange, and this is the part that most finance channels skip entirely. The Eurodollar system doesn't just hold dollars, it creates them, and no central bank approved that. Through a process called fractional lending, the same mechanic your local bank uses, offshore institutions can lend out dollars they don't technically have, as long as they trust the counterparty. Bank A lends dollars to Bank B. Bank B deposits them with Bank C. Bank C lends them to a corporation in Singapore. The same dollars now exist in multiple places simultaneously, as liabilities and assets stacked on top of each other. This means the global Eurodollar supply expands and contracts, not based on what the Fed decides, but based on risk appetite across the global banking system. When banks trust each other, the dollars flow freely, credit expands, emerging markets boom. When that trust breaks down, like it did in 2008, the Eurodollar system seizes up, dollar liquidity vanishes, and suddenly there's a global scramble for actual dollars that the Fed didn't even see coming. That's why in 2008, the Federal Reserve had to open currency swap lines with foreign central banks, essentially emergency dollar injections into a system it technically doesn't govern. Think about that. The Fed had to rescue a dollar system it didn't create, doesn't control, and can barely measure. Then here's the part that should make every investor stop and pay attention. Because the Eurodollar system doesn't just affect banks and governments, it affects your portfolio directly, right now. Here's how. When the Eurodollar system is expanding, credit is loose globally. Emerging market stocks surge. Commodities run hot. Risk assets climb. Investors feel invincible. When it contracts, the dollar strengthens. Hard, not because America is doing well, but because everyone globally is scrambling to repay dollar-denominated debt. They need dollars. Demand spikes, and everything priced in other currencies gets crushed. This is why you'll see the US dollar rally during a crisis, even when the crisis starts in America. It seems backwards, but it makes perfect sense once you understand the Eurodollar system. This is also why macro traders watch something called Eurodollar futures, a market where institutions bet on future short-term interest rates in the offshore dollar system. Before the CME renamed them in 2023, this was one of the most traded futures contracts on Earth. Traders used it as a real-time gauge of global dollar liquidity. When those curves flatten or invert, it's the market signaling that Eurodollar credit is about to tighten. That's often a leading indicator of a slowdown, sometimes by 12 to 18 months. Most retail investors have never heard of it. Professional macro funds watch it every single day. Now zoom out for a second. We live in a world where the Federal Reserve is treated like the all-powerful controller of global monetary conditions. Politicians testify before it. Markets hang on every word of its press conferences. Entire careers are built around predicting its next move. And yet, the largest dollar system in the world operates completely outside its jurisdiction. The Fed sets the overnight rate for domestic banks. But the price of dollar credit in the Eurodollar market? That's set by thousands of bilateral relationships between institutions across the globe, shaped by trust, risk models, and collateral chains that no single authority governs. That's not a flaw in the system, it's a feature. It's what allowed global trade to scale beyond what any single government could have engineered. But it also means the system carries a fragility that nobody fully controls. And every decade or so, that fragility shows up. 1998, 2008, 2020. Each time, the scramble for dollars reveals just how dependent the world is on a currency it built a shadow version of, and how exposed everyone is when that shadow system cracks. So the next time you see the dollar spike during a global panic, you'll know why. The next time an emerging market currency collapses, even though their own central bank did nothing wrong, you'll know why. The next time the Fed cuts rates and somehow the world still feels tight on credit, you'll know why. The Eurodollar system is the shadow engine of global finance, invisible to most, felt by everyone. And the people who understand it trade with an edge that most retail investors simply don't have.